So, I guess the first thing is a big shout out to our mutual colleague Cynthia Rebholz. I don't even know if I'm saying her name correctly. How do you say her last name?
Rebholz, yeah.
Rebholz. Yeah. So I met her in grad school. She was a supervisor of mine when I
Okay.
was in the University of Maryland Couple and Family Therapy program. She was a nighttime supervisor, and that's where I first met her. And she was at that stage in her career. I remember her being, supervisors sort of have reputations on like, oh, this person likes this modality or that. And she was an EFT gal at that point.
Mhm.
Um, but now I see on your website, she is a certified, trained finding peace practitioner. So we're going to talk about what that is. But first, for people who are interested in you, they might have already watched some videos and they're just trying to like pick up everything Troy Love on the internet, and they stumble into this conversation. But for folks who don't know who you are, just tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came into the line of work that you're doing now, Troy.
So somehow or other, I came when I was about 21 years old. I went to college like you're supposed to. I had no idea what in the world I wanted to be. I ended up sitting in I thought I was going to become an English professor, but I took a 7 a.m. old English class with a book that was like 3 inches, and I think the teacher was from the Middle Ages, and I was like, there's no way in the world I'm going to do that. So I bounced around and I ended up in a social work class, social work 101, and it just was like harp singing and angels choir, and I was like, this is for me. And I had a professor who told me that if I wanted to be a really good social worker, I needed to do my own work, which meant I needed to go to therapy and do some stuff. And at the time, I thought I didn't have any issues. I thought my teacher was really crazy,
Mm-hmm.
and that she didn't know what she was talking about. And then I started to do social worky stuff and realized, oh my gosh, I have a lot of stuff that I need to work through. And so I began working on it. And now I've been a licensed clinical social worker for nearly 30 years. And I've learned a thing or two along the way. And my goal is to try and help other people do their work so they can find greater peace, joy, and love in their lives.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So it sounds like the path, obviously, as is true for most folks, is winding. But like you were describing, Troy, something was just clear in terms of a resonance and a certainty of like, oh, this is where I belong. This is my path somehow, whether that was clear to me
Yeah.
before or not. But and different mental health programs, I heard anyway from my mentors and people who were so old that they wrote the test, right? The national test. Their license number is 001. They got the first license in the state, and they're saying some programs you have to do they're like, we don't graduate our students unless they go do their own work. And I'm curious, when you were in your program, was that a requirement? Did you say?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in doing your own work, did that start when you were a student or after you graduated?
It did. So I was getting my master's at the University of Pittsburgh
Mm-hmm.
in social work, and my internship was at a drug and alcohol rehab facility. And honestly, I was terrified. I I this was the first time I'd been working with adults. I had worked with teenagers before, but this is the first time I'd worked with adults, so I was scared about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd never done drugs. I'd never drank alcohol, so I didn't have any concept of what that was like. I grew up in a pretty predominantly strict Christian household. And so I felt really inadequate in helping these people. But the more that they began to tell their stories about being abused or being rejected or being abandoned or all those kind of things,
Mm-hmm.
and how their way of coping with that was stumbling on some drug of choice that at in the moment seemed to make things feel better, I realized that they were telling my story, that I had grown up with some profound traumatic experiences, and I had found ways that I was numbing, and
Mhm.
that really was the door that said I got to go to therapy. And so I started therapy when I was getting my master's degree.
Yeah. Yeah. And my guess is, I have no idea, but my guess is it wasn't the majority of your cohort or the students in your class who you were training with who were also entering into that discovery
Right.
of, yeah, the healing
Yeah.
process. Yeah. And you talked about it being scary, as well. You should have been scared, working with folks who are struggling with those, um, I want to say substances. There's a part of me, Troy, that kind of actually hesitates about calling the different drugs substances, but they're, as you were saying, people find these chemicals or what they think is a medicine, and
Mhm.
it's doing, because it's doing something. They're getting value out of it, and otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. There's something valuable,
Right.
and yet, of course, from the other perspectives outside of the individual's own nervous system, it's just, there's something so destructive about it. And so that is, I mean, I would be intimidated if it's a heck of a setting to be learning the ropes.
Mhm.
I am curious also about, do you work, when you're working with clients or practitioners at your practice who are helping the public, is there a drug and alcohol component? Do people who are struggling with some sort of a addiction, and not like gambling or porn, but an actual exogenous chemical that's being put into their body? Does your practice help folks who are struggling with that?
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I'm curious about what did you learn in those first chapters as a burgeoning social worker that was formative, or that made an impact in the way that you meet people's energy who are affected by those challenges, or substance use disorder.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that I realized is that they're using their substance, or they're using that behavior to try and deal with pain.
Mm-hmm.
But there's deep and abiding pain underneath all of that. And so rather than try to shame them or try to criminalize them, to help them understand that you've been doing these things in order to try and cope with some things that have happened in your life. And maybe if we could help you deal with the things that are happening in your life, you wouldn't have to keep finding ways to numb the pain as much, and you actually can live an abundant, present life, loving the people you love and doing the things you love to do. So that's really the goal. It's doing trauma work for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how does that message land on people at different points in their journey, on how receptive they are to feeling affirmed by that message, or being resistant to it or fighting against it?
Never I've never really had anybody resistant to it. A lot of people welcome that message. Um, I've never really had anybody fight me back on that,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean they could, but it's more of a compassionate, non-judgmental kind of a place
Mm-hmm.
that I think is an essential ingredient to overcoming any unwanted behavior is compassion. And they
Mm-hmm.
shame themselves enough already. We don't need to add to it.
Amen. You could say that 1,000 more times. That the power of compassion was something I didn't. When I was a grad student, you learning about like compassion fatigue. You're like reading a bunch of articles, and but the actual embodiment of compassion and watching, it feels like magic, right?
Mhm.
It's like, oh, you've got curses. Guess what? This compassion lifts those things.
Yeah.
Wow. Like, why didn't they? What can the medical model get hip to this, or teach students? I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for obviously all the grad programs, just from my experience, but only later, 8, 9 years. I guess Kristen Neff's work. Maybe I came across that a few years ago, but just somewhat recently have I really appreciated how
Mhm.
powerful that is. And it doesn't surprise me to hear you saying, yeah, no, it actually really fights me on that message, because it's so affirming, it's not judgmental, and you're speaking the language that something inside of them deeply knows already and resonates
Yeah.
with. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
finally. Yeah. Yeah. So Troy, when you graduated, just again, tell me a little bit about your pathway to where you got. So what happens after grad school for you?
So I graduated in from Pittsburgh, and then I sent out resumes everywhere. And the only place that responded was this place in Yuma, Arizona, where I'd never even heard of Yuma at the time. Um, they it's a small community mental health program. They convinced me to come. They told me I was going to make $29,000, which was like a year, which is more than I'd ever made in my life. I was like, "Wow, that's like so exciting!" They told me that they were going to pay my student loans. That didn't turn out to be true, but that's another story.
Mm.
And so, sight unseen, got in a freaking U-Haul and drove to Yuma, Arizona, which is in the southwest corner of Arizona. So Arizona is shaped like a square. We're in the southwest corner of it. I'm about 10 minutes from California and 10 minutes from Mexico. I really am right down in the very bottom. And we thought that we were going to stay here for just a couple of years and then move on. And I've been here since 2000. So nearly 30 years, 25 years being here. It's been a great place to raise kids, and there's no snow. So I never have to shovel the snow. So that is something I'm really grateful for. I worked there for a couple of years, and then I moved over to the hospital, and I was a medical social worker for about 4.5 years.
When you say the hospital, are you talking about a state hospital?
No, just like a regular medical hospital.
Okay.
Just like the people coming for heart attacks and strokes and that kind of stuff. And I learned a ton. That's kind of where I grew up. I learned a ton about people's conditions. I worked all over the hospital, in the emergency room, and mother baby, and the surgery floors and ICU. Like, I had an experience of seeing like pretty much all kinds of walks of life, all kinds of people struggling with all kinds of stuff. And then I moved into HR for about 4 years, and I was a leadership consultant there. And then I just felt this pull that I really fought for 2 years, but just pull that I needed to take everything that I had finally gathered as I was doing my own therapy, as I was learning about working with other people, as I was consulting with people in HR, using all of that stuff and creating a private practice. So I left a perfectly good job in 2009 and started the private practice that I work in here in Yuma, called Yuma Counseling Services. And then a couple of years after that, I created Finding Peace Consulting, which is more of an educational side of things to help a broader audience with recovering from trauma.
Yeah. So I appreciate the narrative and the story. And I've got, as you're telling it, Troy, I've got like little mile markers that I want to walk down. But rather than me picking the mile markers, I'm curious. I'm curious if there's anything else about your background, your origin story, that you feel we maybe just went right over and we didn't touch it, that you feel would be useful for our listeners. I know you might not know very much at all about the audience, but that people who are listening to this podcast, generally speaking, when I have a guest on that's a mental health expert, that they're open and curious to all the different perspectives and different like nuggets of wisdom, because there's a vast knowledge, as you're nodding your head. I mean, there's this differences, and you might hear like 80% of the same stuff, and then you hear someone talking like, oh, no one ever brought that up. Is there anything in your professional past, or personal, I guess, before we kind of look closer at the development of your practice and the services as a psychotherapist versus, the broader audience that you're talking about?
Yeah. So when I was in the rehab facility working with them, and I realized they were telling my story, I realized that I was addicted to porn, which is not something I even thought was a thing. but I felt a lot of shame about that. And so I wanted to understand. I wanted to figure out how to stop doing that. It was destroying my relationship with my wife. It was wreaking havoc in my spiritual life, all of those things. So I wanted to understand why. And so as I was doing therapy and doing my work, I began to put this model together that's finally, eventually called the Finding Peace model, but this model together that helped me understand what was happening with me. And then I started to explain it to other people. And the foundation of it is based on attachment wounds. As humans, we're wired for connection biologically, socially, sexually, spiritually, all of those things. And if something happens that breaks those connections or causes damage, it can cause wounds. And there are 6 of them: loss, neglect, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, and abuse. And as I was starting to put words to that, I realized that my original wound was abandonment. I was adopted at birth. And one of my therapists helped me understand, like, you were in your mother's womb for 9 months, and then overnight you weren't, like, you were gone. So a huge abandonment that I had never really considered, but can see how that pattern shows up a lot in my life. I was bullied a lot in middle school. So huge rejection wounds. I grew up in a home where there was a lot of domestic violence. My dad would hurt my mother, and then my mother would hurt me and my brother. So lots of domestic violence there. So my world didn't feel safe. And so as I started to put those pieces together, I was sexually abused as a kid. Like, so I'm like, wow, like, I'm putting all these pieces together. I have rejection, I have abandonment, I have abuse, I have neglect. Like, no wonder I turned to this behavior to try and comfort myself when I didn't really feel like I had anywhere else to go. And so again, that compassionate piece. So as I started to put that together, I'm like, okay, so now what do I do with that? How do I heal that? And that's where the rest of the model really started to unfold itself as, okay, so I have a wound. What am I going to do to care for it and create an environment where it can start to heal? And that really became the premise of the work I do, both in my private practice and everything we do at Finding Peace Consulting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with me and with our audience. It's really, really important. I know that's like self-evident for you and but it's important for me to thank you for sharing that. And all we've done is now create more mile markers to go in, and we only have 2 hours or less than that. So I want to be disciplined about it. And so I guess the first thing brewing in my mind is, when you talk about healing and the wound, again, the way I'm thinking about it, Troy, is these 2 landscapes: your social work background and a psychotherapy practice, and then the Finding Peace Consulting. You've got an educator inside of you, that has to do that, right, and gets a lot of reward from that. And they're different for a reason, but they both help people heal and grow. And I'm curious, when you talk about the wounding and compassion, what did that look like for you as you were making a U-turn? You call yourself an inner treasure hunter, right? Like, for yourself, the process of developing the model and learning about where these wounds get stowed away, and how you discover them. And yeah, as much as little as you want about that. But I'm curious, how much were you informed by what you learned in grad school versus just your own clients teaching you about stuff? Just, yeah.
I'll say a little bit about how much I learned in grad school. Not much. Part of that is because at first I didn't go the mental health track. I went a leadership track, and then I realized I couldn't be licensed as a therapist if I didn't go the mental health track. So halfway through, I flipped, and the only therapy class left was a Freudian psychology class. So I learned a lot about that. But most of this I learned in the real world. When I was working as a medical social worker, it was back in the days before the electronic medical record, and so the patients would have like 2-inch thick
Case
charts
files.
that
Yeah.
everybody was working through.
Yeah.
So, and this, our notes that were always at the back, so I'd have to flip through all the stuff to get to my site. And sometimes I would come across some pictures, a section where there was pictures of people's wounds. And they had wound care nurses that would come in and they would measure the wound and they'd see how bad it was and how it was created. And the wound pictures were gnarly. They were pretty,
I believe it.
they looked painful, and I couldn't stop looking. It was like a train wreck. I was like, whoa. I remember one person had a tunneling wound on their back that was about 3 inches in diameter, and the reason why they call it tunneling is because it was like drilling a hole through their body. Like you literally could put your fist inside the wound. It had come from a person having pressure ulcers and the body not being turned. So the nurses were incredibly concerned because it could be life-threatening if they couldn't figure out how to help the body close this wound. And so I was fascinated by that concept of like, they have these nurses who specialize and make recommendations about that. But what about our emotional wounds? Nobody sees those. Nobody sees them. We can't take pictures of them. We can't take a measuring tape and measure how big it is, or assess how long it's been there, but it can be just as lethal if we don't take care of these wounds and we don't find a way to start healing them and creating an environment where emotionally and physically and spiritually our bodies can heal those wounds. Then we're as bad as the patient with the tunneling wound who's going to die if something doesn't happen. And that really was one of the things that I started to use as an analogy for me of, okay, so where are these wounds? And they're like sunburns. So I have a rejection wound, I have an abandonment wound. If you've ever had a sunburn, you can still function. You can still go about your day-to-day life. You may be a little bit cautious and you don't want anybody to come up and touch you because it hurts. But if somebody does bump up against you, your body has a visceral reaction. Your body reacts and you pull away, or you want to push people away. And that's what happens with these attachment wounds too. Somebody can say something or do something, like my mom's eyebrow going up is a huge, slight behavior that has a massive impact on hitting my rejection wound. And then my body reacts and I want to pull away, or I want to isolate, or I want to push people away. And so understanding that was the premise of how this all started for me. Is like, wow, we have these wounds, we react not because we want to. I react in ways that actually don't serve me really well, but understanding I'm doing that because I'm scared, I'm doing that because I'm hurting. Oh, well, maybe if I start to calling the wound of, giving the wound a name like the nurses do, this is an ulcer, this is whatever, and here's what we can do to heal it, created an ability to start putting language around healing those attachment wounds for me.
Yeah. So the natural follow-up. So thanks for sharing that. The natural follow-up is, all right, we've given it a name. You said 6? There's 6. Can you go over those one more time?
Yeah. Loss. Loss is a wound that happens when you have someone that you're really close to who maybe passed away. You were really close to them. The DSM, in their latest update, the really only massive change they did was people who are dealing with prolonged grief, that they've lost somebody, and that's just excruciatingly painful. But there's other versions of loss, like maybe you grew up in a military family, and so every 3 years you had to say goodbye to your friends and you had to leave certain areas. So the loss wound is like you had something in your life and then it was taken away just because of life, not because of any malicious intent, but it still hurts. Neglect happens. There's the child protective version, CPS version of neglect where mom and dad have been gone for 3 days and the kids don't have any food, and there's a kid running around in the stinky diaper and all that kind of stuff. That's unfortunately happens, and it's sad. But there's also a less it's still serious, but people don't recognize it as that, where
Right.
the kid has their basic things met. They have roof over their head, they have clothes, they have food, but when they need emotional support, their parents are too busy. They're too busy, and you and I've seen it. You go to a restaurant and everybody's on their phone, like nobody's actually connecting.
Yeah.
That can create a neglect wound where we end up believing I must not really be that important to you. Rejection comes when you're told by others that there's something wrong with you, you don't belong here, you have cooties, you can't be a part of us, you need to leave, you need to go away. Abandonment happens when you have a relationship of with somebody, you're close to them, and then they evaporate, they disappear overnight, they're gone, you don't know why, there's no closure, they were here and now they're gone. And so you're not really able to understand why they left. You just are now dealing with the fact that they're gone and what does that mean, and there's not usually very much closure with that one. Then I'm going through all of them.
Betrayal, was that one?
Yeah, betrayal. When you have a relationship of trust with somebody and then they do something that violates that trust, they steal from you, they cheat on you, they take credit for something that you did. So they've broken that trust with you, and now you definitely don't feel like you can trust that person, but you also might not feel like you can trust other people. We got loss, neglect, rejection, abandonment, betrayal. One more. And then abuse, which is physical abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, where somebody is inflicting their suffering on you. So that can come in different forms. So those are the 6.
Yeah. Yeah. And so thanks for laying that out again in, a little bit more detail for people to discriminate. And part of me is like, how you have a Venn diagram. Part of me is like seeing them in where they can, where the nerd mapper, the cartographer of mapping this stuff out conceptually, see where they overlap and converge. But there is a reason why they've been distinguished and distinct in their categories, no doubt. And what you're talking about is the power of naming the particular kind of wound, that once someone who has been hurt can name that, kind of see it for what it is. I remember the first time I got glasses, I was a 4th grader. I remember like looking at the carpet and being like, oh shit, wow. Like, look at the trees, like, look at the leaves, look at the clarity, right?
Yeah.
It cheapens the experience to just use language to describe it, but people who know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about. And so when you give something a name, it frames it, or it allows a person to be able to look at it with almost kind of new sight or new vision or new openness to it. And once they have a new awareness and a new openness to it, now they can interact with it differently. Right. And I'm curious how you help people once they've identified and named the wound, the emotional wound, which, as you say, is like when it's unseen and it's hidden, it's easier to just overlook or for our culture to dismiss, or harder to treat, perhaps. What's the next? How do you help people after they've labeled or named the wound? Help listeners know. Yeah.
So I tell people that it's not actually the wound that causes us suffering. It's what we've come to believe about ourselves as a result.
Yes.
So as kids, oftentimes that's when most of these wounds are developed. Not always. Sometimes they get developed as we get older, but as kids, when these wounds start to be developed and we have a very egocentric mentality, we can't comprehend that the world does not revolve around us. We start to wonder, well, why did dad leave? Why is mom beating me up? Why are these kids telling me that I'm no good? Why don't we have any food in the house? And the only conclusion that a kid usually can come up with is, well, there must be something wrong with me. I'm not enough. I'm bad, I'm flawed, I'm no good. So they can start to develop one of three genres of core beliefs. And the first genre is about me, my identity. I'm bad, I'm no good, there's something wrong with me. The second genre is about safety or trust. I can't trust other people. Other people aren't going to show up for me. Other people are scary. People hurt me. So I'm not sure that I can reach out and ask anybody for help because they're probably not going to show up anyway. And then the third genre is about powerlessness. There's nothing I can do, no matter how hard I try. It's never going to get any better. So we can have the trifecta of all three core beliefs, or we could just have one. But what happens is that over time, when every time the wound gets hit, and that's what we come to believe about ourselves, neurologically, our brain creates a neurological connection where now every time that it's hit, our brain is responding that way. And so we go right into the fight or flight response every time because we now don't feel safe. So being able to recognize, like, when I'm having a good day and my wounds aren't being hit, I'm not necessarily thinking that I'm a bad person or I can't trust other people or there's nothing I can do. But the moment that wound gets hit, it automatically activates that network of trauma response in our brain. Our hippocampus says, yep, here's all the reasons to remember. My amygdala is hitting the panic button saying we're not safe. My prefrontal cortex goes offline, so I'm not thinking clearly. And all of that is done being fueled by this core belief that will then lead me to behave in ways that are not going to help my wound get healed, but it's my fight or flight response.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is this difference between the actual original wounding event, the original wound, and what comes in following that wound are these core beliefs. And you detailed three categories of those, right? And those beliefs enter into the person's mind, body, spirit, however you want to look at it. They enter in and they get stuck there. And healing people is not just going and, oh, there's the wound, let's put in some healing medicine. And it's like, no, if the beliefs are still there,
Right.
the way the person is reacting, almost like I don't know, the image that comes to my mind is just like if you drive a automatic transmission, your car, when you put the gas on, like, it knows when to shift to second gear, and third gear, and fourth.
Yeah.
And so it's just doing that. And so if the beliefs are in there, the mind, body, spirit is just reacting automatically, right? And so helping someone not only label and identify the wound, but get curious about the beliefs is a really important part of it. What are these core beliefs that have been carried around for all the years that follow from the original wounding? And how do those beliefs drive the behavior, right? Like the fight or flight response. Like, if I believe I'm powerless, or I'm no good, or they're not going to include me, like, I'm not, like, yeah, I'm going to go to some, like, let's talk to like the professionals who go to continuing education events, and then there's like an opportunity to go out to lunch with people. It's like, I'm just going to eat lunch by myself. It's too risky to ask someone, oh, do you want to go to lunch together? Like that stuff. So the belief drives that, that limiting behavior, right? Which just keeps it. And you're talking about the neurology part, or the neuroscience of it, the neurons. Just the more the person does that, it's like what we focus on and repeat, it just strengthens the connectivity, right?
Absolutely.
It's kind of a vicious cycle. Okay. So I really, really appreciate it. You can tell I'm like super enthusiastic about not only getting this for myself, but to make it crystal clear for people, because I think one of the things that converge about what you and I do is just not only the direct care and the direct healing, but trying to just scale it up and bring as much healing to the community as possible, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so when people have identified and gotten clarity, kind of like my fourth grader putting on glasses and being like, whoa, once they have that clarity and can recognize, oh my gosh, this is what I've been carrying. These beliefs I've been carrying this my whole life, for much of my life. And this is how it's driven my choices that have also been limiting to my potential and my flourishing and all that. What kind of walk us through what happens next? How does the individual navigate that new knowledge, that new awareness?
So part of that is helping them understand that this has probably been ingrained in you for a long time. And so just because we have figured out that, oh, when my rejection wound gets hit, this is the core belief that gets activated, does not solve the problem. We now need to start learning some tools to practice self-compassion. We need to learn some tools to, like, cognitive behavioral therapy type of tools to reframe and rewrite and can change the core beliefs so that when that wound is hit, the automatic response isn't that I suck and I'm a horrible person, but that, oh, that hurt. I know that I can get through this. I'm enough. I matter. So that takes practice and it takes mindfulness to be able to help people understand that this is just because we figured it out doesn't mean that it's going to solve anything. We have practice and lots of opportunities to try.
Yes, exactly. Lots of opportunities. And you're quite right. There's a vast chasm between, knowledge and implementation and the actual embodiment of the applied knowledge. And so you're saying the mindfulness of, okay, keeping an awareness of, oh, all right, this is what I'm thinking and feeling and believing and sensing right now. And now in this radical present moment, I have the opportunity to choose differently. Right. By the way, to any nerdy philosophical listeners, whether or not you believe in a deterministic or a libertarian free will universe doesn't matter. The felt sense that you have choice, right? The felt sense that I can choose differently. And you're talking, when you talk about CBT and alternative beliefs that challenge the negative core belief that it got into there when the original wound happened. What are some, forgive me if you said this and I just missed it. What are some examples of not only the alternative beliefs, but maybe some resistance or stumbling blocks where people are trying to implement what you're guiding them to do, and they're finding difficulty doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So one of the worksheets we have is the core belief challenge. And it's first is, okay, what's the core belief? And then on a scale of 1 to 7, how much do you believe that core belief is true? 7 being it's absolutely true, 1 is it's completely false. So we'll start with that. So let's hear the core belief is that I'm unworthy of love. I'm a horrible human. Okay, Troy, so how much on a scale of 1 to 7 do you believe that to be true? Well, a 5. I'm like, okay, great. So now we have a little bit of wiggle room. It's not a 7. So we have somewhere to work with that, right? Or they say it's a 7. I'm like, okay, that seems like it's really embedded in there. And they're like, yeah, it is. And then it's okay. So then one of the questions that we ask in this worksheet is, well, what is the benefit that you get out of holding on to this core belief, even though part of you might know that it's not true? And usually people balk at that. They're like, I'm not getting benefit. Like, this is ruining my life. And I'm like, well, the truth is, if you weren't getting some benefit out of it, you wouldn't be holding on to this core belief. So what is the benefit that you're getting out of believing that you're a bad human? And then they sit with it for a minute and they're like, well, I don't have to take accountability for my choices. I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to let people know what I'm feeling. It's like, oh, okay. So how's that serving you? Well, it's not really serving me. Okay. But that's part of the reason why you've been holding this out as a death grip. And so what would happen if we were to challenge that a little bit? What would happen if we were to let it go just a little bit? What would happen? And we process that.
Yeah. No, I'm fully tracking, and the piece of what you shared that I focused the most on was the multiplicity of mind. I'm not sure if Cynthia told you that I'm an IFS guy.
Okay.
Very, very as hardcore as you can get. Right? like if the analogy or the imagery that I'm using here is like if all the IFS people are told like here's where the beach is where the IFS people swim in, and don't go outside the buoys though, right? Like you stay in the buoy. I'm like, I'm not only getting on this beach and swimming with, I want to swim outside of that buoy into farther IFS territory that even those in the IFS community are like, no, we actually reject that because that's too strange and weird. So I'm really curious or eager and excited to get to deeper levels of this conversation regarding the things that are outside of the psychotherapy citadel, right? But so when you were talking about the beliefs, saying that part of me believes this, like if they're not a 7, if they're a 7, it's like all of me believes this, or it seems to be the case that all of me believes this, right? But if they're a 5, hey, part of me believes this, but part of me doesn't, and the multiplicity in those two different perspectives. Okay, well, the part that doesn't believe this, that's not any piece that is maybe holding on to the thing because they don't believe it. They reject it fundamentally. They somehow were protected by this original event, this wound, and the belief didn't get into that part, right?
Right.
However, there's this other set of you that does believe it. And when you're negotiating with a person or inviting them really to, what would it be like once they've bought into the notion that, oh, okay, I could be open to the fact that I'm getting some sort of payoff or benefit from doing this. What would it be like to let it go a little bit? What kind of challenges or resistance do you encounter with people that you're helping? The nature of the human mind to not want to let go of something that they've been holding for decades, say, right? What do you because you're a seasoned practitioner. So what do you find when you're inviting someone to, what would it be like to try and let that go?
So one of the things that hijacks all of that is shame.
Mm-hmm.
Shame, Brene Brown defines shame as a deep and abiding belief that I'm flawed and defective and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And so shame is like this blanket that attempts to cover up the wound, attempts to cover up any of the behaviors, attempts to cover up all the emotion that we're feeling so that we won't be seen, so that we won't be hurt, so that we won't have to deal with stuff. But it doesn't work very well and it becomes very maladaptive. Shame's a pretty daunting thing to deal with. And so over the course of the work that I did, I learned how to personify shame. So when you mention IFS, this is going to sound similar. I didn't actually know about IFS when I developed this, but so I personified shame. And shame, there are 6 different characters or archetypes that shame has, that what I tried to help people understand is like, these have been in your head and I want you to take them out of your head. And I want you to actually imagine that they look like something, they sound like something, and I want you to take them out of your head. So the difference that I've learned now between me and IFS is that these are actually not you. They have their shame. You are an amazing being of light.
Yeah.
These are not who you are, but they have showed up as a way of trying to protect you. So let's have a conversation with it. So when we start to help them understand which of the shadows of shame is out, then they have a lot better ability to be able to create some distance between what that shadow is saying, connect with their truth. And then when they look at the core belief, they're like, yeah, that's not true. This is what's actually true.
That's so important. So also I appreciate that when you're saying, when I was developing this, I had never even read about IFS. And isn't that funny that like so many different model developers arrive at similar dynamics of what actually is going on when someone has malevolence inflicted upon them, and how they heal and respond and bounce back from that, you know?
Right.
And so what you're talking about is this, you call it the shadow of shame, right? And to say like,
very Jungian.
Of course, right. Well, also like a being of light, what's its opposite, right? Like, so totally right. And so the part in IFS terms, or this shadow of shame, that when we can personify it and get some distance and some separation from it, then magically there's a shift in perspective about who I really am. And they're coming back to that example of the belief and the person that labeled it, I believe this 5 on a scale of 1 to 7. Once there's, what you're saying, Troy, is once there's separation, the one carrying the belief is the one being separated out, this shadow of shame. And then now that it's outside of the person's being, whether we want to call that a spirit or a mind or a body, it's just separate from your being.
Right.
And now you're asked the question again, how much do you believe this? Is that what you're saying? And then that's where they can say a 1. I don't really believe it at all.
It's not
Right.
true at all.
Right. Not true at all. Not true at all. And from that perspective, from that, the you that they are when they're not believing it, you have now, what you've done is temporarily anyway, separated the being that's carrying the belief.
Mhm.
And so this is, I'm right on board with all this, right? So then, so now what happens to this poor spirit or soul or fragment of the person, the shadow self that is, say it's 9 years old or whenever it took in this belief, and it's still carrying the belief. It just happens to not be housed in the person anymore, in their being, in their essence. So now what happens after the thing is separated? The being is separated.
Well, we don't spend a lot of energy on the shadow. We spend more energy on how can you connect with what is actually true. So now that we've been able to separate the shadow from your light, how can you connect? So what is true? I'm enough. I matter. I'm worthy. Okay, so now where do you feel that in your body? So we get into somatic stuff. Where do you feel that in your body? Can you breathe into that? What can we do to help you connect with that? Because later on today, somebody's going to raise their eyebrow and it's going to hit that wound again. But what can you do to connect with this truth? And how can we start practicing connecting with this truth and reminding you that this is actually what's really true about you?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So really what you're saying, it's almost as if, and tell me if I'm reflecting this back inaccurately, Troy, what you're really saying is once this being is separated, now you have a new ground to stand on, a new access of what is actually true. And it's just kind of through exposure therapy or just through repetition and practice, just remembering what's actually true when you have that separation from the shadow being. And then you walk through your day, you go to the grocery store, someone gives you a side eye, and you get that kind of reactivity or that flare up again, which we might attribute to that shadow being who's doing that old thing, right? With its belief. But because the person has gotten a glimpse of their true nature, they can, how do you think about, do you think that it's them interacting with the belief once again, just from a different place on the path?
It's them connecting with their truth.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm enough.
Yeah.
So that person's looking at me with a stink eye.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what's going on with that person. He must be having a bad day. And I don't even internalize it. It's just like, oh, I'm enough. I'm here doing my thing. Hopefully they're well. So my capacity for empathy increases.
Mm-hmm.
My capacity to be less judgmental increases. My ability to be kind to others increases because I'm connecting with my core truth that I'm enough, I matter, I have purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody gives me the stink eye and I'm just like, oh, hope you have a better day.
Yes. Right. And even if on the outside, that's the difference in the behavior, on the inside, someone may still be feeling that
They might. Yes, the shadows come back.
Yes.
So the interesting thing is that when you connect with your light, in that moment, usually the shadows just go away.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't necessarily have to send them away.
Mm-hmm.
They'll go away.
Yeah.
Because their number one job is to try and protect you from being hurt again. But once if you've connected with your truth, they don't need to protect you because you've connected with your truth, so they go away. They're not bothering you anymore. But later on, if something happens that bumps up against one of those wounds, they may come back And the more that I'm able to connect with that, the more that I recognize what it feels like when they show up, and the more I'm able to say, hey, oh, you came back. Hey, well, what's going on here? And become curious about what's going on here, and then reconnect with my truth inside.
Yeah, I get all that. That all makes sense to me. And my question is, do you find that after people go through this methodology and this approach of essentially reorganizing their nervous system and healing, do you find that the shadow being, it ends up just visiting less? It's beginning to trust that, hey, this person really doesn't need to remember and re-recognize and wake back up to the truth. They're actually like pretty good at it now, and that the shadow being doesn't need to make those visits anymore.
And what I've discovered is that they get better at recognizing that when they show up. And so
Okay.
the shame shadows, they're still going to show up because their whole job is to protect you. But like, I've been doing this for a while, and so when I'm talking with my friends, I'm like, hey, my judge just showed up. This is what my judge is saying. My judge is stupid. Like, I can't believe, and I'm actually able to just talk about it. Like, this is what they're saying. I'm not actually buying into what they're saying anymore. It's not as impactful, but they showed up, and
Yeah.
I can hear them. So it's not that they it's my ability to recognize and my ability to not buy into what they're
Yes.
saying
Yes.
becomes stronger and stronger.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not buying what they're selling, or I'm recognizing that it's a lie,
Yeah.
that it's not true. Yeah, that makes sense. And it also makes sense that that would have a profound impact on how one navigates the world, how they view themselves and view others, and have more access, like you said, to empathy, to compassion. Yeah. So, okay. So I really appreciate you kind of walking me through, and our audience as well. I want to kind of ask, I mean, I have a couple of other questions brewing here, but is there anything that you think I haven't asked you about or followed up on so far in what we've been talking about, that you think I've missed something hugely valuable? I'm talking to Troy Love here, and I haven't asked about X. Like, what are you doing here? So I want to ask you, what have I
Do
not
you
asked
want
you?
to know what the 6 shadows of shame are?
Heck yeah, of course. See, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
So the one that most people recognize the most when I introduce them is the judge.
Mhm.
Some call it the inner critic, but it's the voice in your head that is always pointing out your flaws, telling you that you're not enough, you haven't tried hard enough. Why did you wear that? That's embarrassing. You look stupid. You need to try harder. You're not perfect. Oh, you need to improve. The judge has a belief that in the way that you avoid any of your wounds being hit is by being perfect.
Mhm.
And so if you're less than perfect, the judge is going to point out how you're less than perfect, because it believes that you being perfect will save you from experiencing any more pain in your life, which is not true, but that's what the judge believes.
Right.
So I'll have people imagine in their mind, like, okay, if you were going to take a picture of the judge and you were to send me a selfie, like you and the judge are taking a picture, what would the judge look like? What would it sound like? And so really trying to get that judge out of their head and into the room. If I'm in therapy, we do empty chair stuff.
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, so imagine that the judge is sitting on the couch, and what is it saying to you?
Mm.
And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. On the opposite side of that scale is the royal. And the royal believes that you're better than everybody else,
Mm.
that you're worth more than everybody else. And so it gives you a message of like, you don't need to fix anything. People should understand just who you are and how amazing you are. And they should bow down and worship the ground that you walk on, because you're so freaking amazing. And you never make any mistakes ever, any of that stuff. And the Royal believes that we can't look at being human. We can't look at our mistakes, because if I did, then that would be evidence for the judge that I'm not enough. So we just ignore that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the judge, the royal creates a huge sense of entitlement. Don't you know who? Don't you know who this guy is? Like, he's amazing. And the challenge with that is that if either of them are operating and I'm buying into what they're selling, my capacity to connect with you is squashed. Because if I'm buying into the judge and think I'm better than you, I can't connect with you. And if I think that I'm worse than you, I can't connect with you. So my ability to connect, which is how we heal attachment wounds,
Yes.
is squashed.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next two are the politician and the martyr. The politician is very worried about people's votes. It's very worried about people liking you. So the politician will say things like, don't let anybody see that you have problems. Don't let them know that you're struggling. You got to hide that. You got to put on a mask, pretend that everything's fine. You need to look nice, dress nice. Don't let anybody know, because if anybody finds out that you have these problems or these wounds or any of these things, they're not gonna like you. They're gonna reject you. They're gonna abandon you. They're gonna betray you. All the things. So its belief is, yeah, you have them, but don't let anybody see them, because bad things will happen if anybody sees them. So you got to cover it up and pretend that everything's okay. The main driver is to get people to like you. And the martyr tells you that your needs don't matter. Everybody else's needs matter more than yours. So the way that you can find value in this life is sacrificing yourself for the greater good. As long as you are throwing yourself under the bus and lifting everybody else up, then people will pity you. They will give you praise for all that you do. So that's how you get your needs met, is through sacrificing yourself for the greater good, which is exhausting and
Unsustainable.
No, tries really hard. And the martyr also thinks the more passive aggressive you can do it, the better.
Oh my. Yeah.
And then the last two are the impotent one. And the impotent one, it's kind of like Eeyore. Nothing you do ever matters. No matter how hard you try, it's never going to get any better. I don't even know why. Oh, you're trying to lose weight. You're never going to lose weight. Probably going to put on 10 more pounds after you lose weight. You probably should just give up. So it's this message of get up, give up. Like, don't try, stop. It's just stop beating yourself up. It's just never going to work kind of feeling. And then on the flip side of that is the rebel, who says, screw that. You can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter if it's illegal. It doesn't matter if it's going to cause harm to you or your loved ones. If you want to do it, you can do whatever you want. Don't ever let anybody tell you you can't do anything that you don't want to do. And so when that one's running, then there's no concern for anybody. It's just all about you. So those are the six.
Those are the six, and you presented them in clusters, in dyads, in groups of two, sort of. And I don't know if this was true. I kind of noticed it on the front end and on the last end. The middle pack, I didn't know if it was true, but I'm wondering if, clearly this is my my intellectual part that holds all of this stuff conceptually and likes to create connections or recognize connections or patterns. But do the six shadows of shame, these shadow beings, do the three groups of two, are they kind of on opposite sides of a polarity? They're in battle. So group one, they're battling with each other. Group two are battling, and group three are battling. Yeah, that's interesting. I have to ask, I'd be a fool not to ask you. You came up with mapping it this way, conceptualizing it this way, and tell me and our viewers and listeners exactly how did your clients taught you, saw this stuff unfolding, and your clients are just, I don't know if this is kind of a weird question, but how are you recognizing this? How are you doing it?
Well, I didn't recognize it at the beginning. I had some help with figuring out the shadows. I called them differently than my mentor who helped me. But it was after I really gave them names and started to understand how they worked that I started to recognize how they work on these polarities. So I didn't recognize that at the beginning, but that I did recognize, like, the judge and the royal, the spectrum that they work on is appraisal. So if you have a house, property that needs to be appraised, you have somebody who comes in and evaluates it, and then they tell you how much it's worth. So that's what these two are doing. They're appraising you. One's telling you you suck, and the other's telling you worth more than any other property in the neighborhood. The the image or the spectrum that the politician and the martyr work on is image, how you are seen. They really care about how you're seen, and these two kind of work hand in hand more than polarity, but they're both very worried about how you are seen. But politician wants you to be seen as perfect. The martyr wants you to be seen as like the savior of all mankind. And then the last two is the spectrum of power. You're powerless, or you're more powerful, the most powerful being in the world.
Yeah. And these are, I really appreciate, I have a lot of admiration for the humility and curiosity. You mentioned your mentor didn't conceptualize these as personified beings. Is that right?
Oh, he did. He helped me figure that part out. That was life-changing for me when I was able to start figuring out these are not me.
Yeah.
I mean, I know in IFS you would maybe refer to them as the firefighters, but in my language, like, these are not me. My judge has been following me around since I was 8 years old, and it doesn't ever go away. It's like, but that's not me. Like, I'm not the judge. And the more that I was able to distance myself from the judge, the more I recognized I'm not as judgmental of other people. I used to be so freaking judgmental. I was the perfect parent of all the other people who had kids before I had kids. But my judge was like so much a part of my life. But the more that I was able to separate it, is like, that's not me. And I was less judgmental as I'm pushing him away.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that is huge. Even if so, in IFS, there's like like empty chair gestalt. Like when there's a separation, IFS doesn't have the license to parts, in terms of a framework of mind. But just that, there's like several shifts that are really healing for someone, and just that shift of separating and saying, "Oh my gosh, that's not who I am." Just that alone it's huge. That's the difference between I have a license and I can drive myself versus I have to wait for my mom to pick me up. It's huge. It's huge, right?
Yeah.
But more than that is then actually, once you see that that's not you, you do recognize that there's a being that's not me, who's carrying all this baggage and feels the burden of having to check your hair. Is your hair okay? Are they going to judge you? Right? Like, it's still carrying that energy.
Yeah.
And so not just separating, but then this is where I've had this appreciation for the magic, and I don't know any other better word to say it other than magic. Yeah, totally. The magic of compassion, to have compassion. So let me give a concrete example. I don't think I've ever talked about this on the show, but this was before I learned IFS. As a parent, I'm dropping my kid off at school and didn't send her with a rain jacket or something, and it's raining, right? So I didn't prepare her, right? So now I'm feeling totally shitty. Like, what the fuck kind of dad are you? Like, are you kidding me? You're able to be competent in all these other areas, but like, you can't even remember to help she's not going to remember her rain jacket. This is your job, right? This is the critic. This is the
judge. That's the judge.
That's exactly right. Oh,
sitting in the passenger seat with you.
Brutal. And well, what's so funny that you say that. My wife was driving. I was in the passenger seat, and this was a really magical moment in my life when I had separation from just the brutal energy that this guy was unleashing on me. But I had this new ground of, rather than being hurt again by what this guy is saying to me, I actually, number one, was protected by the bubble of compassion. So what he was slinging at me, the mud he was slinging at me, wasn't actually getting on me, number one. And then number two, my compassion was outward bound and for him, and was saying, oh my gosh, like, why are you so ruthless? right? Like seeing the suffering behind. So this being has all this like harsh bullshit, but I was seeing the suffering underneath of that, or behind it, or however you want to spatially recognize it. Why do you have to talk to me this way?
Mhm.
And that compassion, yeah, you know how he responded? I don't even remember how he responded. I think it just shut him up kind of. I
That's
think
right.
I think he was just like, I can't get through to you. If I can't get through to you, then this is a lost cause, and I'm packing up my bag and going home, quote unquote home.
Exactly.
But that was the beginning of recognizing the power of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've come to realize since then is that the compassion not only protects you, it softens the opponent or the interlocutor, however you want to say, right? The one you're interacting with, softens that being, and then can actually heal that being so that it doesn't have to carry what it's carrying anymore. Because again, as you had laid out, it's the one with the beliefs, right?
That's right.
It's the one. So the compassion actually heals this being, and it can then begin to let go of what it's carrying. And even though it's not me, it's in IFS, it's like it's a really valuable member of the community. And rather than just like pushing it away, it's like, no. Let's heal you. What we're going to do is we're going to push away the negative energy. What I'm now viewing as a negative entity inside of it. In our culture, we could call it a demon. We can get into that, but like the belief that's like a virus, the belief that has infected this being can get out of there. The compassion blasts it away with light, and then the being comes back in. And now, oh, surprise, surprise, Robin's inner judge is not a judge anymore. He's this wise, discerning coach.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's and it's amazing. So that's kind of like the magic of this stuff. It's so, and this isn't, it's a little bit different than, maybe different means, but maybe you get the same outcome than challenging the judge's beliefs. Like the judge believes you're a piece of shit, you're a terrible father, and then just being like, actually, hold that. Let me pause you for a minute. Let me look at my list of all the ways in which I'm a good dad, right?
Yeah.
That kind of like it's like a balancing scale, but giving it evidence. Sometimes I feel like if you ever been any listener or viewer has ever been into an argument with someone, when you present your evidence, they're being driven by their beliefs. Sometimes they dig their heels in, and it just escalates it.
Totally does.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm curious what you're thinking and feeling and reacting.
No, I follow that. So I teach people there's 3 steps to this, and step 1 is to notice the shadow and call it out. So you say to it, "Hey, judge, I see you. I see you in the back seat there talking to me," or "I see you standing there." And when I'm working with clients, I'm like, "Okay, point. Where in the room is it right now? Just point. Just point." And they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Just point. I don't care. Just point." And
don't overthink it.
Right? It's right here. And it's like right behind me, and it's like breathing down my neck. Okay, so just notice what that feels like, to notice that it's right there. And they're like, "Yeah, it doesn't feel comfortable." But also notice it's not in here anymore. We've taken that out. So that's step 1. Say, "Hey, I see you." And just notice what happens when you say to the judge, "Hey, I see you." And 99% of the time, the judge stops talking. The judge has not stopped talking the whole time, the whole morning. "You're a bad dad. Can't believe that, blah, 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 blah." But all of a sudden, "Hey, judge, I see you." And the judge is like, "I didn't want you to see me.
Yes.
I didn't want you to see me. And so all of a sudden I see you," right? So then you ask it a question. What wound are you trying to prevent me from feeling or experiencing right now by telling me that I'm a bad dad? And if you listen, it will tell you, "Oh, I don't want you to feel rejected. I didn't want your wife to be mad at you. I didn't want you to." Oh, okay. So you were trying to protect me from feeling rejection. Step 3, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for trying to take care of this. I got it. I'm a grown-ass man now. I can take care of this myself, but I really appreciate you. That's so kind of you that you're worried about that. Thank you for reminding me I have a wound that I need to be compassionate about. Thank you so much. And as we do that, the judge is like, "Oh, I guess I don't have anything else to do. Buy a coffee or something." And off they go. until the next time. But then I'm like, yeah. And I've now done compassion for myself. I've been able to say, oh, okay, my rejection needs to be taken care of. What can I do? How can I help with that?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a couple things I want to say about that. The second step, tell me if I'm wrong about this or if you see it differently, Troy. If someone, it's like, I see you, they've created separation, they recognize, and it is funny how these beings, like, once they're seen, they're like, no, I'm supposed to be operating this thing from the hidden places, like the puppet
Yeah.
master, right? And they're like, so sometimes they're just like shocked. They're like, oh, you're not supposed to see me, or if I just freeze and go quiet like a predator, like a prey animal, you'll just keep going. When you ask it the question, what are you trying to protect me from? What wound are you protecting? If you're not true of heart or sincere or humble or actually curious, sometimes very often actually, if you have an agenda, you're like, just tell me what you're trying to do here. Like, they don't react well to that. They need to, you have to actually want to, you have to ask as if you actually want to know.
Mm-hmm.
And with patience, as if like they're not obligated to tell you right here and right now. They don't have to tell you. They can tell you when they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think that's really important for people to know. Like, you can try to ask them, but if you're asking them and putting the pressure on them, like, they're going to do what anyone else would do necessarily. Go ahead. You want to say something?
Well, no, you come from a curious perspective, a mindful, curious, hey, what's really going on here kind of a place. You're going to get a lot farther with that kind of a place or energy than, what the hell do you want?
Yeah. The analogy comes as like a parent who their kid comes home with a report card and they say, what happened in science class? Right? They're curious, but that kid feels the parent being like, what went wrong? Right? They feel the other energy nested in there. So there's all these like pseudo curiosities. There's all these, like, they're not the real McCoy. And in my view, the real McCoy is the calm, curious, humble. I actually am sincerely, authentically wanting to know, and there's no pressure to find that out. That's number one. Second thing, I wanted to ask about. Gosh, I think it flew away. I was so fixated on the second one. I'll tell you what. I want to ask. Well, let me ask you. It's really paid off to just pause myself, slow myself down, and ask you, because then you provide these nuggets that our listeners get to enjoy. I do want to ask you about the finding peace, a little bit more about kind of the spiritual lens of that. But before we even ask about that, is there any kind of unclosed circle to these concepts and steps that you've laid out here for the audience?
I think we did a really great job of talking about that. The people will wonder, some of the common questions people say is, well, will I ever get rid of my shadows of shame? And the answer is no. We experience shame as humans. The only people who don't are sociopaths. So we can admit that we struggle with shame and be open about that, or we can be sociopaths with, I've picked option 2. Or option 1. So just recognizing that shame is part of what's been embedded in our culture since the beginning of time. And that doesn't go away, but learning how to become resilient to it, connecting with the truth of what's behind it, understanding that it was there trying to protect us. It does a lousy job, but it's trying to protect us from being hurt. Then leads us to be more open and then willing to actually find healthy ways to get our needs met, healthier ways to lean in and ask for help, be vulnerable, all those kind of things. Once I got the shadows quieted, I can actually take my wall down and maybe lean over to my wife and say, oh, man, I'm feeling like a really crappy dad. We didn't give her that raincoat today. And your wife says, oh, honey, it's okay. Sun's going to come out in a minute. But being able to like have that conversation rather than I'm not going to say anything, just go stew in my shame all the rest of the day.
Yeah. And I there's something I view differently about sociopaths that I'm in the minority. So you're in the majority opinion on sociopaths. So I want to name that explicitly. In my view, they do have shame, and
Oh,
it's like everyone else has shame that can be found at the bottom of the ocean floor, and sociopaths are down at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It's
oh, I
just deep,
believe that.
it's
Yeah.
deeper. Yeah, yeah. It's
They,
way
they-
down deeper in the darker, colder places, but it's still
right.
there.
Yeah, they still, the opposite of that, the opposite of shame really is the capacity for empathy. So the more that we're able to develop, like if you think about it, like the shadows of shame make it all about me, me, me. But the more that they are able to shut up and be quiet, the more that I realize it's not about me. It's about you and it's about the world. And I start to have an increased capacity for your wounds and your pain. And I want to help ease your suffering. And for some people, that's a lot easier to do than other people.
Sure, sure. Well, Troy, let me ask you about the maybe let me ask it this way. When we kind of framed the territories of your role as a social worker and a psychotherapist, and then you're like, okay, so people who are shopping for these consumer services, like here's one package or one bundle, and then or just point of entry. Maybe that's just the point of entry. And then there's this other, the inner peace consulting and the inner peace certified practitioners. And I think it's so cool that you have developed a model and there's a process of getting certified and educational concept. I mean, I just think that's great because I love the resources of the community. We could say, look at all these convergence. Oh, that person, that model developer, it's just the same thing. He's calling it a different name, but it can be so helpful for different minds to access concepts differently. So I just want to, I don't know, celebrate that about you,
Thank you.
and what you've provided our community.
Thank you.
And to talk a little bit about some of the key differences in these two. I do want to lead the witness here, right? Which is like, to what degree is spirituality folded into your role as a social worker or a psychotherapist? To what degree is it nested or integrated into your role as a inner peace practitioner? And just however you want to answer that question, I'm curious about the role of spirituality and seeing yourself or others as spiritual beings or having access to divine love, etc. So
Mm. Well, me personally, it's woven into everything I do. Um, I believe that I am a fairly spiritual person. At one time in my life, I had a concept that my form of spirituality was the only form of spirituality, and I've learned that is absolutely not true.
at the Royal.
That's right. Royal. I know better than all y'all, right? So I was able to recognize that and recognize that people have had trauma around like religion in particular, and being sensitive around that with some people. So with not some people, all people, but being able to recognize that, to me, there is a sense of spirituality. There is a sense of something greater than ourselves in whatever way you want to define that to be. And so for me, I've figured out what that looks like for me and how I can incorporate that and to be a being of light and a being of love. That's my goal, is wanting to create more light and love in the world, and then not trying to make somebody fit into my perspective of what spirituality is, but rather help them figure out what spirituality looks like for them. To me, light is part of spirituality, and the more that a person can connect with that energy of light, the easier it is to see the shadows, the more that it's easy to see through their lies and their deception that they're playing, the easier it is to become resilient to the messages that they're saying. So the more that a person's able to embrace their spirituality, the easier this process becomes. It doesn't become simple, but it becomes easier. And then depending on how far you go with spirituality, I believe that the spirituality has the capacity to heal wounds. People often ask, like, well, can these wounds ever be healed? And I'm like, absolutely, they can be healed. And it's like when a sunburn goes away, you're not as sensitive anymore. You're not gingerly putting on clothes, and you're not worried that Bob from accounting is going to come up and pat you on the back. You're free, and you're able to just, and if somebody taps you, there's no reaction. I believe spirituality plays a huge role in healing those wounds.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate particularly the notion of not imposing a framework or a belief system on someone, but having it in the background there for its artful application at the voluntary consent of the individual. And also to your point about healing, is healing possible? Yeah, that's a really important message, especially to I'm going to forget the brand of the part, but I remember when you were describing that shadow being, I was like the pessimist, nihilist. What was the name of it?
Impotent one.
Impotent, you said. Yeah, exactly. Right? Like that it's almost like that's the rallying flag of that one, which is like, it's just not, this is the one who's polarized with the rebel, who's just like anarchy, whatever, doesn't matter, we'll do whatever. And just the notion of like, it's not possible. I remember I did a training with Dick Schwartz and Lissa Rankin on IFS for medical syndromes. And one of the beliefs that people can have around healing is like I'm not worthy of healing, right? Like other people get to heal, but not me, right? That might be the martyr to some convergence in the martyr, but like, or I don't deserve to heal. I'm too fucked up to heal. If I heal, things will actually get worse. Right? To your point about what's the value of staying in this stuck trauma, right? Yeah. Like if I heal, then I'll be in more danger, which maybe doesn't sound intuitive to some listeners.
Oh, totally does.
Yeah.
What I hear is like, I won't be able to have the attention placed on me. Like, so when you think about the attachment wounds and you think about the opposites of them, like the opposite of rejection is acceptance. The opposite of neglect is attention. The opposite of betrayal is trust. When you think about what the opposite of those are, like the fear is, if I've been trying to get those needs met in a really maladaptive way, attention seeking, drug use, whatever. Yeah. They're counterfeit. But when I actually learn how to get those needs met in an authentic and real way, that's beautiful. So the fear is, if I stop being sick, if I stop feeling all this, I might not get the attention, I might not get the compassion. And the truth is, they actually probably get more, but that's the fear.
Right. Well, and that, it may sound strange, but I only in the last year, maybe 18 months, have conceptualized fear as a being itself. Right. Not because of Disney Pixar's Inside Out, right? Not because of that, but actually in IFS, these parts carry burdens, which are the extreme beliefs and emotions.
Yeah.
And in classic IFS retrieval, and it's cool when you learn about, oh, this is what shamans do and soul retrieval, and you're like, oh, this is again kind of the phenomenology and inner dynamics are kind of the same here. We're just calling them Pepsi or Coke. And exactly. It's like, right. And it's like classic IFS is going back and retrieving that little 8-year-old, bringing him into the present, and then bringing him somewhere safe and comfortable, and then helping him know that it's actually now safe to unload and let go of this burden, of this trauma, of this belief. And the menu that IFS practitioners give their clients is like, you can let it go into the fire, into the earth, into the wind, the water, give it up to the light. So these elements, earthly elements, the celestial element of light, can transform these burdens. And as a newbie practitioner, I was just like, that's cool. And so the burden, just let the water wash it away. Let the water will take care of it. This little 8-year-old doesn't have to take care of this thing anymore. Right. And take it away. And then in its place, I looked at it like real estate. Like now that this 8-year-old has this like hole where the burden used to occupy space, now we're actually going to let the positive stuff fill that hole. And now this being is more complete with all these positive qualities. But I didn't think that the burden was a sentient being. In IFS, they don't teach you as if it's a sentient being. But when I was giving you the analogy of like beyond the buoys on that IFS beach, like I want to swim out to where they say don't swim past that. That's where you start to conceptualize. You get different results when you start to treat the beliefs as if they are sentient. Like when you were doing that thing, like, where is it? It's next to me. It's behind me. Where's the belief? That fear of all the emotions, like the root structure to the matrix of zeros and ones is like fear and trust. Like everything is afraid. Every emotion has a fear. And if you then conceptualize that fear as a being, and it's like, whoa, now, like, we don't want to just like throw this being into fire, like just so that we can get rid of it and like send Johnny on his way and be functional in his roles. It's like, actually, if we treat this being as if it deserves God's love as well, instead of just doing that, like actually offering it the option to go to the healing realms as if it's a lost ancestor, or with radical respect, it has its own agency and free will. If it wants to scurry back into the darkness, it can do that. We don't want that, but it gets to choose. But it no longer belongs in Robin anymore. It can't stay here. If there's no part that wants it, it can't stay, like an unwelcome vampire or whatever, right? Like you can't, and no one maybe you were invited in, but now that we've fully let you go, you can't stay here, you know? That's what I'm now seeing in I guess we can talk more about it off air real briefly. I can't talk yet because I haven't disclosed this publicly, but I'm now having more appreciation of what this work is and how psychotherapy doesn't necessarily have a container to do ancestor healing. And I'm curious if in your line of work and your experience, have you ever done anything more with these shadows other than just help them learn that they're not who the person is, and to trust basically that the person is a being of light and that their efforts are positive intentions to help the person protect them from old wounds? And has your work ever set the sights on healing the shadow beings?
We've done work on recognizing that those shadows have also been plaguing our parents, our grandparents, being able to recognize like that, having compassion for like my father and recognizing that he had shadows, that guy, he had wounds and he had shadows, and being able to see that and have compassion for that and offering healing and forgiveness, for lack of a better word, to him, and not carrying that around with me. We've done stuff around that.
Yeah. That's very powerful. And it makes sense when you say we've done stuff around that. Are you talking about in both kind of camps of the services that you offer? Yeah.
Like what I do in therapy is this model. I use this model with all of my clients. What I do in Finding Peace is teach the model to other people, whether that's at a retreat or in a class or through certification. I'm teaching the model to other people, but in this hat, I use it every day, all day long.
Yeah. Okay, appreciate that clarification. Yeah, the nature of when you say people's parents carry shadows, and I'm appreciating that these, in my view, you know, these shadows exist in a spiritual realm. And the spirit realm is free. It doesn't follow the same laws of physics that in our realm with time and space. I remember I had this intellectual part I was working with, and it went away. It went like a 500 miles away, and the person who was working with me were like, "Just call it back." like distance isn't a concept that applies here. About like it could go a billion light years away. It could come right back here, right? And time isn't like I'm going to turn 40 in May, but like the 8-year-old me is still right here in the present. So those concepts of time and space don't apply. And with ancestor work, we say, oh, Robin's carrying a shadow being that's carrying some burdened belief system, some extreme fears or shames, right? And how exactly did that come into Robin? And was it given to Robin by his mom, his dad? And if we don't just look at it simply like, oh, you got this from your dad or your mom, but it's like, but your mom or this shadow being was tormenting your mom and your dad. They were tormenting them. And I was at a training where the woman was unburdening this legacy burden, and Dick Schwartz, for those who don't know, is the developer of IFS, Internal Family Systems, but he invited the client not only just like, take this burden and where do you want to give it up to? Again, earth, water, wind, fire, light. But then knowing that it was a legacy burden, to actually pass it back to the ancestors, to say like, you hand it to your mom and give the mom's spirit, who mom wasn't alive, give the mom's spirit the opportunity to hand it back to her. It was up the maternal line, up to like feudal Europe or something. And they all got to hand it back. So all the ancestors had the same experience of being able to let it go, because it had been plaguing all of those ancestors.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
And the person who's alive in earth, it was shouldering it. So it's strange to then be like, okay, who's my client? Is my client the person, or does the target shift to the thing that's in my client that actually needs the trust and the healing?
Yeah.
And then once it can get out, then the person's free of it. Although what's interesting is, like, you know, when you have like a virus or a bacteria and your doctor gives you antibiotics and it knocks it out, but like your gut is pretty, your gut needs to restore and repair. So it's interesting when these things leave. That doesn't mean that's not the end of the movie. Yeah. There's still like residual
healing. You have
healing.
to replace it with something else.
Yeah. Well, quite right. Because these things know how to sneak in from the back door.
Oh, yeah.
They leave traces. And that's very insidious. Because like they can offer, like one of my mentors, Bob Falconer, uses this example of like a 12-year-old who's offered a pocket knife. It's like, whoa, cool, a pocket knife. It's like this thing knew exactly what to give, what to offer, so that it could be allowed to stay, because it didn't want to go.
No.
And then so he had to work with the 12-year-old, you know, no, you can't take this pocket knife, you know. It's amazing work. And I kind of want to I want to ask you about, before our time is over, Troy, you know, you've been a public speaker, like you've been doing the work kind of on the ground, but how long have you been, not as an educator, but as a, I mean, I guess we do educate the public when we speak, but like, how long have you been doing public speaking and having that as a part of your path and the value you bring to the community?
I've been a public speaker for probably 15 years. It's a little bit more prominent lately. I'm spending a little bit more time focusing on that, but I've been doing that for about 15 years.
Yeah, and in your 15 years of speaking, what can you share with folks about what that role is like, or you know, why you do it, or how you make time for it, or just I'm just curious, because not every public speaker would answer that question the same. And how do you take it?
Oh, if I'm being honest, so I have. So before I answer that,
sure,
there are two things that came up as you were talking.
Yeah.
One is, one of the beauties of identifying what the attachment wounds are is that I don't have to blame anybody for them. I don't have to blame my mom. I don't have to blame my dad. I could if I want to, but I don't have to. It's kind of, I tell people, like, if you got bit by a rattlesnake, you have two choices. You could beat the rattlesnake to death because it bit you, or you could actually take care of the snake bite, and then you'll survive. So if I have a rejection wound, I can blame whoever did it to me. But at the end of the day, it's my wound. I got to do something with it. It's not. I don't need to blame that. So uh, that that's part of what that came up. I don't have to blame anybody. I just deal with the pain itself. So I have a rejection wound. I have an abandonment wound. So one of those needs is I want to be seen, right? So being a public speaker makes that really easy.
Mhm.
That's the honest answer. Like it does make that really easy. The challenge is the whole time I'm doing it, my judge is standing there saying, "You look like an idiot. Oh, I can't believe you said that. They're gonna hate this. They're gonna think this is shit." And so I'm like, "Would you shut up for a while? Just let me enjoy my moment, okay?" So there's that goes on, but so that is in part honest. But really, what drives me to do that is it's changed my life. This has helped me learn and grow, and watching people's eyes light up and watching tears fall down their face and helping them start to shift those things. That's really why I do it. It's not really about me. It's watching them grow and them shift and them find greater joy and light and love in their life. Is my that is my huge motivation right there.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense to me. Makes sense to me. You know, I associate it to the eclipse because it's obviously like in recent memory, right? Like I don't know if it's exactly the same emotion, but just like the notion of like, if you're into not just looking at the glasses, but if you can take the glasses off, if you're in totality and you're looking at the sun with your naked eye and you're just in awe and you're just like, oh my, you're just kind of, it's ineffable, you know, and that feeling. Yeah, there's few things like it when you watch someone heal. When you watch a person being able to release and heal, it's very gratifying. It's
the best thing in the world.
Yes. Well, and you know, I've been recently thinking about just like the spiritual path, right? Like if I had plans, like I'm over looking off screen here at my guitar, my high school self was like, you're supposed to like make it big, get a record deal, tour, right? Like, right? Like that's like, and it's like God's plan for me was like, no, you don't. Like, that's actually not your calling. Now, music's a gift. So the question is, okay, how can I integrate my gifts? And get humble and curious about that. And like I said, I can't talk about it publicly yet, but some big things are shifting for me.
I can't wait to hear about it, man.
Professionally, and they're unexpected. They're completely unexpected. I was an atheist for 20 years. I was an atheist in grad school. I was an atheist when I was getting trained in this stuff. So realizing no longer an atheist, and realizing the power of this permanent healing that can be brought when embodying divine love is just something I didn't have a container for. I never, if someone had come into the clinic at University of Maryland and given a talk on this stuff, I would have been like, that guy, right? Let's go get Potbellies for lunch, right? Like I just wouldn't have, I wouldn't have had any place to hold it.
Right.
But there's nothing more powerful than it. And by the way, I'm actually, I hope you don't take this the wrong way. I have hope that when you go do public speaking and your inner judge is making a mess or whatever, I actually have hope that guy doesn't have to keep doing that if he doesn't want to. And that's where your methodology and the deeper waters of IFS are maybe just see it a little bit differently with regards to transformation and permanent healing. Because I'm looking at, I don't know if you know who Jerry Marzinski is. He's also in Arizona. I don't know where though. I think Tucson maybe. He works with the criminally insane and schizophrenics, and the medical model does not see schizophrenia as being able to be healed, but that's wrong. And the voices on the continuum of suffering and what the judge says, and anxiety, depression, worthlessness, and paranoid schizophrenia, the continuum of mental disorders and mental illness, the healing is the same. And the ones who are afflicted by all the voices, they're just deeper in the Mariana Trench. Like doesn't mean we can't lift them up above the water. why am I bringing this up? I don't remember. As a podcaster, I also identify with this. Clearly, there's parts of me that need to be seen in there, right? Like clearly that's, and I know that that's a part of me that's doing the podcaster role. But yeah, I want to thank you again for your time and for the work that you do. And a big shout out to our mutual colleague, Cynthia Rebholz, who put us in touch. And is there anything else that, I also want to compliment you on your book, on your website, the book section. All those books are great. I was surprised to see the David Goggins book too. Like you've curated a great catalog there. So folks should check that out. We're going to put your website in the show notes and everything, but anything else that you want to point people to that people should be aware of before we bring our talk in for a close?
I just want your listeners to know that they are worthy of love and belonging. They're enough. They matter. There's a reason why they were born on this planet, and they are loved.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I could piggyback on the heels of that message, I appreciate that message. And if listeners and viewers are hearing that message and noticing any reactivity or any pushback to that reactivity and that pushback or that skepticism or whatever it is also worthy of love and lovable. And
Absolutely.
yes, not exempt from love and compassion. Yeah. Troy Love, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Robin. It's been awesome.